So I'm Richard LePlastrier. I'm an architect. I've been in practice for nearly 50 years, and I was taught by Lloyd Rees, and he became one of my greatest friends up until the time he died. Well, Lloyd taught for nearly 30 years at Sydney University through generations of architects. And he was actually first employed there by Professor Leslie Wilkinson, who was concerned for the young soldiers and pilots who came out of the Second World War and were redoing their education. And he arranged for Lloyd Rees to be the teacher of drawing and art in the School of Architecture. What a masterstroke by Leslie Wilkinson. And so when I was a student in 1958 is when I started my course. One subject was a Wednesday, and it just was Art L. Rees. And we were all very wet behind the ears. And so Wednesday came along, and in came this very distinguished looking man. He must have been at that time maybe 65 years of age, but he looked much more than that to us. And he came in and he just discussed with us his trip across in the ferry, what a wonderful city Sydney was, and that we were going to do drawing with him for 5 years. And of course, none of us knew who he was, and none of us knew how good he was. It took us quite a long time to find that out, because he didn't talk about his own work or himself very much. And so drawing started with Lloyd there in 1958. And when I look back on it, and how did he teach us? Well, he didn't teach us in the classical way so much as this is the form of the body and this is the cylinder of the chest or anything like that. What he managed to do with us over a period of 5 years was he taught us to love to draw. That's the secret. If you can encourage somebody to love to do something, then just by their own nature and creativity, they'll do it and do it well. It's a great lesson. And other things that he used to teach us, in ways in which he used to teach us, was that if you were faced with a drawing that you'd done and you were not at all happy about it, and you were saying, whoa, I wonder how he's going to feel about this. Of course, architecture is about one-to-one teaching. A teacher will come around to students one-to-one in architecture, as against lecture theatres and that sort of thing in normal, formal university education. It's not like that in architecture. And Lloyd would come up to your drawing and you knew it was hopeless, and he'd look it over like this and he'd find a section of it that worked. Or he'd say, there's a lovely passage of space through here. Why don't you work on that? Or something like that. He always found the positive side of things. That's why he was such a great teacher. And then he allowed you to build on your positive side. He never criticized in negativity or in negative terms. Spending time with Lloyd in that school was quite remarkable, because he didn't confine us to the school itself. He was always taking us outside, out into Victoria Park, or out into the great cloister of Sydney University, which I think is one of Sydney's great rooms. And he would point things out to us there, and he would say things like, well, picture the cloister in full place around here, because it was only ever half built at Sydney University. Or he would say, now look at this corner of the cloister of the university in the quadrangle. He said, this is the Department of Philosophy, and there is the only tree in the whole of this garden, this cloistered courtyard garden. And if it were November, then the petals of the jacaranda are falling on the ground there. And he'd point these things out and he'd say, well, why don't we spend an hour or 2 hours just drawing here? And that's what we'd do. And at other times he might say, now you remember that tree in the courtyard. Why don't we paint that for next week? So he taught us how to be very free in our handling of watercolours and charcoal, and not to be stitched up at all. And that was fantastic for us, young aspiring architects, to gain a freedom and a confidence in the materials. You know, drawing and painting, they're very different things. I can remember much later on in life, when my friendship with Lloyd extended far beyond university times, that he taught me at one time how to actually see the colours in the landscape. He said, what you have to do, and we were outside somewhere, maybe in Tasmania at this time, he said, just soften your vision off, blur it, put it all out of focus, so as all you are looking at are blocks of colour. He said, and then start your painting from there. So it wasn't about fine detail, it was about this collage of planes of colour. And it has been a very good lesson for me all of my life. Even in watching rugby, I put my eyes out of focus and I watch the pattern of the game of the colours, and I can very quickly tell how the balance of power in the play is moving. It's been a great lesson from Lloyd over many things, not just painting and drawing. But getting back to the university, well, for 5 wonderful years, he taught us to love to draw and to be free with paint and with colour. There was never any issues about passing and failing. That was not part of the equation. It was about art. And as you know, like art, works of art light things up, put a torch onto something. A great work of art always does that. And so to spend that time with Lloyd was amazing. And then if you couple that with his great understanding of art history, and it's stemming from the Mediterranean in a Western sense. He didn't know very much about Japanese art or Chinese art or things like that. He'd be able to look at a great drawing from Japan and wonder at it. But he didn't know he was Western based. So combined with his love of drawing and involving us deeply, and his sense for history and time, I couldn't imagine a more wonderful introduction to art and lessons which lasted all of us, 3 generations of young architects through his tutelage, to have a great appreciation of life. What a teacher. I had to laugh, you know, because it would have been about 1980, you know, after I'd been out of university for some time, but our friendship had wonderfully extended. And I was over at his place because we'd been working, just going through the text of his beautiful book called Peaks and Valleys. And it was highly personal because he didn't pull any punches in that book. When he was down, he said, and he told us about it in that book. And as we'd work the text through together and I'd read it, because his eyes were going at this time, he couldn't read it. So I'd read it for him and then he'd say, oh yes, now I think we can change this section. There was a knock on the door and he said, oh, I'd forgotten. There's a student due to drop her art essay over and she's terribly late. I'm going to have to be very tough on her. And I smiled quietly to myself. Lloyd got up and I could see the glass door had some glass. I could just see this figure outside, and he opened the door and there's this beautiful young woman with her thesis in one hand and an armful of flowers in the other. And she handed the essay to him and she handed the flowers to him and she just put her arms around him and gave him a big hug and a kiss on his cheek. And I could see Lloyd's knees buckle slightly. And he said, oh, he said, oh, thank you so much. Goodbye. And she turned around and left, and he closed the door and he walked down and he put the two things down and he sat back in his chair and he looked at me with a smile on his face and he said, "Well, I didn't handle that very well, did I?" Always full of humour, Lloyd Rees. But it's interesting, isn't it? The friendship went on for a long time. And if I could move from university times to other times later in life, I travelled overseas and I worked overseas for quite a long time. I was away from Australia for 5 years. And I travelled in places at the back of beyond. But I always somehow carried him with me. And I remember sending him a set of drawings of Chartres Cathedral that I did, you know, from the plain, just the rise of the hill and this great cathedral on it. And the note underneath saying, "Lloyd, this is a magical place, I'm sure. It's been a holy place since time immemorial, well before Christianity." So you carry great teachers with you, always. But I came back to Australia after a long time away and a long time in Asia, not just West, but the East in Japan. A long time there. And I returned, and as you do, you go to the local art gallery or to the Art Gallery of New South Wales to get your bearings. Again, art always shows you directions about culture. And I was wandering through the gallery, and there on the wall was his painting, The Road to Berry. Oh, I just took one look at it, and it knocked my socks off. And it crossed the cultures between East and West. That was what was so interesting about it. It could have been calligraphic work from China or Japan. Just the way it extended itself, the form of the hills, and it extended itself well past the frame of the painting. Your imagination was allowed to work. And I saw it and I thought, my God, what a great painting that is. And it said Lloyd Rees, and suddenly it all came back to me. Lloyd. So I wrote him a letter and I said, "Lloyd, I've just seen The Road to Berry. How marvellous." And he wrote back to me and he said, "Oh, come and have a cup of tea." And so we just picked up where we'd left off. And so it went on until, I think, 1988 when he died. A great relationship. Yeah, so there you go. This friendship went on for a long, long, long time. That the times when he went into fits of depression, and he was very honest with me about that when we did Peaks and Valleys, the book. He said at one time he was visiting Sydney and he was staying in a hotel, the Oriental Hotel maybe, right near Town Hall on the corner. And he said he got this fit of depression and he spent 24 hours in front of the mirror drawing himself. And he drew himself out of the depths. And I saw in the exhibition of his notebooks that was at the gallery in the Domain, I saw that notebook and I knew that that set of drawings of him were that set of drawings that he did in front of the mirror in that hotel. I don't think anybody else knew that. I don't even know that Alan knew that. I don't know, but I could tell. I could tell by the look in his eyes. Boy, what a set of sketchbooks they are. Fancy having a teacher like him. So I've always carried my drawing book with me. It's always in my bag. And that was also reinforced by working with Jörn Utzon, who told me exactly the same thing. Always carry your sketchbook. When you see something that inspires you through the day, draw it. And in the end, over many, many years, that becomes embedded somehow within you, and you are able to read place almost without thinking. It somehow comes welling up. You have just an understanding about it, and you can react So they both said it. Lloyd also said when he heard that this little house of ours had burnt down and that all my drawings had gone and beautiful Japanese and Chinese pots, which I was only custodian of, had all gone, he drew into silence for a while, and then he said, you know, sometimes you've got to give things away if you want to keep it. And then later now we have a wonderful Aboriginal elder who's like a teacher to some friends of mine, Stutch and me, who do a lot of teaching together, Max de la Munmun. He says exactly the same thing. He tells us about the Aboriginal way of doing certain things. He said, I'm telling you these things, mate, he says, because if you want to keep things, that is my culture, he's talking, you've got to give it away. Same thing. Interesting. So yes, there's many stories. First of all, they are the documentation of Sydney Harbour, which is one of the great waterways of the world, which I personally have a deep and everlasting love for, and I know it well. I'm a sailor by nature. I've spent a lot of time on Sydney Harbour. Friends and I have fought for issues on Sydney Harbour. And those drawings of Sydney Harbour by Lloyd in that period, a particular period of time, I think will never be bettered, I don't think. And you know what was really wonderful was, in all the time that I spent with him, I remember the time that he told me how he came about the technique of those drawings. He said he'd been drawing or painting, I can't remember which, out at Parramatta, and it was 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he'd packed up his gear and he'd gone to the bus stop, and being the Sydney buses of that time, there was a fair waiting time. He sat down, and because he had the time, he had a stiff card, he took out a bit of very smooth cartridge paper and a 2B pencil, and he started to draw, and he drew with quite a long sharp point on the pencil, but he drew with the edge of that, and he turned the pencil as he drew, and it made this amazing black edge, and on the other side of that black edge, the softness of the graphite. And that's how those trunks of those trees have got that incredible roundness in them. You look at the fig trees that he's drawn. It was that technique. He developed it on a bus shelter near Parramatta, and he looked at that and he started drawing like that. And so those drawings are amazing for their accuracy in terms of sensibility, but I remember Lloyd always saying, art is not about imitation, it's about reconstruction. In other words, he took those scenes, but he manipulated them. Like I said earlier, art shines a light on things, and he reconstructed those landscapes to tell the story of Sydney Harbour. He edge drew the Balmain skyline with that magnificent tower. He did it with that edge for the pencil. You examine it the next time and see. So I think they're remarkable, those pencil drawings, and I'd love to have one, but I can't. Lloyd just didn't have an interest in architecture. He had a love and a passion for it, ever since he was a young child. And as a consequence of that, he had a passion for cities. He loved great cities. He loved Sydney's harbour. He loved coming over in the ferry. He loved sitting on the after deck of the ferry and watching the landscape going by, bathed in the light. He talked about it all the time. When you see his paintings of the shells of Sydney Opera House, that great painting, he painted that in the way that Utzon saw it. Great shells going up with only pinpoints of supporting points. No windows, no glass walls in it, as if they were free, sailing free. Lloyd saw it. He understood exactly what Utzon was on about. And so his passion for cities and for incidents in the cities, he'd often start his talk off with us about his trip on the ferry and what had happened and how this person went over the side and they pulled him out of the water and wrung him out, and always good stories, but always the human interaction with place. So he passed that on to us. Perhaps some of us more than others, but that was his way of teaching. It was far more than just art. It was the art of life. That, of course, is, as we all have come to realise, is the greatest art of all. Architecture is about the art of living. If you don't have that as the foundation, then you've only got a bit of fashion and a bit of pastry cook stuff going on. But Lloyd had a vision about landscape, I think, which was far-reaching. And this morning, I had a meeting with Stutch, my great friend, who's also an architect, with a very enlightened panel of people at a private school in Sydney who are going to set up a camp for their students in the most fabulous landscape of the Wolgan Valley. So as those kids are taken out and taught about the fundamental things of life and how little we can do with instead of how much we can do with. And one morning, Stutch and I were visiting Lloyd, and we were having tea with him in the morning with the morning sun flooding the room, and we were talking about the Aboriginal understanding of the land and how they kept their culture going for such a long time. And he said, yes, he said, indeed, he said, the Indigenous people of this country are an amazing culture. He said, but we should never lose sight of the fact that it was this land that made them that way in the first place. And that came home to Stutch and I very strongly. And so we've come to realise over time in architecture and in practice and making things that the land comes first before all else. And nature comes first and culture follows. And of culture, the Indigenous culture is the absolute foundation of this land. And when people say to us, oh, we're such a young country, you know, we haven't had, that is absolute nonsense. We are the oldest cultured country on earth. And Lloyd Rees realised that. What a man. So Lloyd's understanding was always essential and fundamental and clear-sighted. Political understanding, he had great interest in politics. He never forgave the government in France for the Dreyfus affair. And he often talked about that. He was absolutely dyed-in-the-wool, fair go for people. He was always to the left in his politics, and we talked politics a lot of the time. He was deeply interested in that side of things as well. And right towards the end of his life, he took the platform in Tasmania and spoke at one of the great green rallies to save the first growth rainforests of Tasmania. And he was a very old man at that time. He just got up onto the platform and away he went, and he swept everyone before him. He kept that edge all his life. Never afraid to express an opinion, but always expressed with great respect for people. Never insulting. I never heard a hard word from him on anything, except when he got a bit upset about the Dreyfus affair and Whitlam getting thrown out of power, but we all got terribly upset about that. He was a great friend. He became a great friend of Tom Uren's. And my friend John Simpson and I had the pleasure of making Tom Uren's house in Balmain, right near Thames Street Wharf. And when that house was platform and structure and the great roof overhanging, but without the walls, Lloyd came over and visited. And he and Tom sat on the couch there and had a great yarn, leaning in towards like one another like two politicians in Parliament, speaking in low sotto voce. And I remember very distinctly saying to Lloyd, he was saying, "Oh, it's really wonderful, this big roof, and there's the harbour." And I said to him, "Well, Lloyd, yeah, thank you very much, but it's just one building." And he sort of pulled himself up to full height. He said, "Well," he said, what else is a city if it's not a gallery of beautiful buildings?" And I thought, oh, you're so right. And what a pity we don't have a lot more of them. We were down there working on his book. You know, he didn't like people watching him paint so much, Lloyd. He didn't like people gathering around him so much, although he would never, you know, react against it. But anyway, we were down there working on his book at Gerringong, where he and Marjorie had this beautiful little house. And it was towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was summer. And he said, "I'd like to take a bit of a break and go outside and take a few notes," which he meant he was going to draw or something. I said, "Well, why don't I take your easel out for you, Lloyd, and I'll set it up for you." Oh, he said, "That'd be great." So I carried the easel out, and it was blowing a nor'easter at the time, and this is on Wherry Beach. And you know, nor'easters can be quite fresh in summer, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I set it up with the strings and rocks to hold it down, and he set himself up, and I sat on the fence behind him, of course not saying a word. And I watched him for 30 minutes in watercolours do a painting that is about this big by this big. And he went into it like a man obsessed, and doing it with both hands sometimes, brushes in both hands. He could use both hands. And in the end, and I saw emerging on this paper this headland with a big cylindrical element on the top of it, and then he got his French brush out, this big beautiful wide French brush that he loved so much, and he mixed up this blue wash in watercolour, and he laid it on from the top down so as it runs slowly down the sheet this way. And as he did it, he hummed, and he as it went across like this. And I was sitting quietly watching this miracle take place. And we unpacked and took everything inside. And about 6 months later, he took me down to the studio and said, "I've got something here for you that you're absolutely connected with." And it was that painting. And it was framed. And he said, "I'd really like to give you this." And he looked at the frame and he said, "But I don't think the frame's good enough. I'm going to send it back and have it done again," which he did. And it was much better. But when I looked at that painting closely, not only was that blue sky so beautifully put in, but the evening star was in it. And I didn't see him do it. And that painting still is with us, and that painting inspired my mother through the times that she was finishing up, and she loved it, and it's almost abstract in its power. So that painting's part of our family now. I remember so distinctly the last time that I met him, that I saw him. And there was a band of us who'd always follow him round to all his exhibitions, and he was great friends with all of us. Stutch, Shelley, me, Simo and co. the builder of his house. And he had his last exhibition in the Australian galleries in Melbourne. And of course we all went down to it. He came over with Alan and Jan from Tasmania. And he must have known that his time was up. And at that exhibition where he was sitting down quietly in the corner talking with people, he drew each one of us aside and we sat down with him. And he spoke with us very simply about his, in a sense, last message to us. I don't know what he said to the others because I would never ask them. But he said to me, he said, "You have a freedom that kings and queens would die for." Fantastic. Isn't that wonderful? And he hoped I'd never lose it, and I haven't.